The senator from Ohio.
Madam President, thank you. I'm rising in support of Senator Sessions' motion to recommit on a balanced budget. I think it's important that we have a balanced plan before us. It's been talked about a lot today, but that means balancing the budget, just like we all have to do in our families and people have to do in their businesses. The states all around the country have to do it. Local governments have to do it. Let's stop spending more than we take in. We can do it over time. We can do it without making the kind of severe cuts that were alleged earlier. We can do it by growing the economy and restraining spending. And so I'm happy to stand in support of that. And I stand here because I'm worried. I'm worried about where we're headed. Our debt now is about $140,000 per household. So just think about that. For all the folks watching today, on average, $140,000 every household in America owes on this debt. It's now something that, has really, in my view, put us in a perilous situation because our economy is already weak, and we've got this huge debt and deficit, unprecedented levels on top of it. This is something that really worries me. I think our country's in trouble. The Democrats have a proposal, their budget's before us now, and that's what we're talking about. It adds another $7 trillion to that debt. It actually doesn't deal with our budget problems. In fact, it actually makes them worse, which I'll talk about in a second. But let me, for a minute, if I could, talk about where we are, because there's a lot of discussion on the floor about, gosh, we need to raise more revenue. It's not about spending, it's about taxes. Republicans are saying, no, the problem really is spending. Let me just explain why we're saying that. It's arithmetic. It's math. It's what the numbers show. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. Now, that's the nonpartisan group up here in Congress that tells us, how much we're spending, how much we're bringing in revenue, and then they make a projection. And they just did this about 3 weeks ago. They said, here's where we're heading as a country. So here's where we are now. This is tax revenues, the blue line, spending is the red line. And what it says, bottom line, is that the tax revenues, under their projections, by 2015, which is a couple years from now, are going to be back up above the historical level. So historically, taxes have been about 18% of the economy, and that's how economists like to look at it. What is the percentage of the economy? And revenue's been about 20%. I'm sorry, spending's been about 20%. So here's 18%, and 20% has been the average. What they're saying is, actually, it gets up to just over 19% in just a couple years by 2015, and then stays up above the historical average over the next decade. In fact, what they tell us is that over the next decade, we're going to have the second highest amount of revenue that we've had in the history of our country, except for one other decade. So when we say it's spending, that's the issue. It's because the revenues, which, as you know, impacts the economy. The more revenue you take out of the economy, the harder it is for the private sector to get ahead and for jobs to be created. We're saying, look, these revenues are actually, by the projections of this nonpartisan group that advises us, are going to be slightly above the average. The problem is here. The problem is the spending. And what they tell us is that in a few decades, here's 2040, that spending is going to get so high that there's no way to catch it with taxes. You can't even do it under the income tax system. It's impossible. So why do we say spending is the problem? Because if we don't deal with this issue, our kids and our grandkids are not going to have the economic future that we hope for them. The prosperity in this country will go down the drain because this spending level will make it impossible to create prosperity. That's the issue before us today. And yet, again, we've got a budget before us that unfortunately doesn't address that issue. In fact, I would argue that it makes it worse. Now, some have said, gosh, we ought to be increasing taxes $1 for every dollar of spending reductions. And what I would say to that is really pretty simple. This line here is about 19% of the economy, okay? That's the revenue line. And that's very close to the historic spending line, which is about 20%. So let's take 19% as the revenue line. The Democrats who have talked today on the floor about $1 of revenue for every dollar of spending cuts, what do they really mean by that? Well, this is 39% up here. Here's 19%. So if you take $1 from each as a percent of the GDP, it would go to about this line here. Where is that? Well, 19 and 39. It's about 29%. What does 29% mean? That means we'd have a government bigger than we've ever had in the history of this country. Again, average has been about 20%. That means we'd have to have huge tax increases to get to a balance. Nobody on this floor, Democrat or Republican, is talking about tax increases of that magnitude. Why? Because that would be about doubling the taxes in this country. So everybody listening today would be looking at their taxes and, my gosh, my taxes just went up by 100%. That's what that would mean. And it would mean the biggest government in the history of our country, so the scope and the size of government would grow. So when you hear 1-to-1, I hope you'll just think about it in terms of what does this mean based on these projections that have been given to us by this nonpartisan group. It means a different country. It means a much bigger government. It means a much bigger burden of taxation. It means we end up not looking like the entrepreneurial, innovative America that's been on the cutting edge, that's created the greatest economy in the face of this earth. And that's our concern. That's why we say we've got to deal with the spending. It's really pretty simple. Again, it's really a question of math.
Madam President, would the senator yield for a question?
I'd be happy to yield.
Senator Portman is such a valuable member of the Budget Committee. He served as Director of Office of Management and Budget. He knows how this situation works. But that dotted line isn't just spending, is it, Senator Portman? It's spending as a percentage of the American economy. So in some sense, that surging upward line of spending is even worse than first glance might appear.
That's true. This chart is as a percent of the GDP. So look, we all want the economy to grow, and actually they project that it will grow under the Congressional Budget Office. Even so, that growth in the economy can't keep up with this great surge in spending. So other folks have said on the floor over the last 24 hours, well, gosh, let's go back to the Simpson-Bowles 3-to-1 ratio, where you have $3 in spending cuts for every dollar of revenue. And that's what Erskine-Bowles testified before the super committee on, that was, what their revenue was, $1 of revenue for every $3 in spending cuts. That's also not what this budget does, this underlying budget, because it actually increases taxes dramatically, even under their own calculus. Again, it's 1-to-1. We've looked at it. We think that the tax increase is between $1 and $1.5 trillion in this budget. So it's the biggest tax increase in the history of the country. What does $1 trillion mean, or $1.5 trillion? Well, it means that you're going to have to tax a lot of people other than rich people. And I would refer you to an economic expert on this, which is a guy named Gene Sperling, who's down at the White House, who talks about these economic issues a lot. Here's what Gene Sperling said about raising $1 trillion. He said you can't do it without hurting middle-class families. His quote was, "A careful look at the math of these types of caps and limits on tax preferences shows that once one takes into account the reality of their impact on middle-class families and on charitable donations, plausible limits raise only a fraction of the $1 trillion or more some have suggested." It's just too much to raise without going to the folks who are making less than $200,000 a year, less than $100,000, less than $50,000. So I would just suggest today that, we've got a problem in this country. It's a spending problem. Yes, we want to get the economy moving, and that will create more revenue, but we've got to address that issue, and unfortunately the budget before us just doesn't do it. In addition to having these huge tax increases, the biggest in the history of our country, this budget also has, huge spending. And the spending is actually an increase. When you wipe away the gimmicks that are in the budget that they've proposed, and we've talked a lot about OCO here. That just means the spending in Afghanistan. They project that all the spending is going to occur that nobody expects it's going to occur, and so because it doesn't, they say, well, that's a savings, and then you're going to be able to spend more to make up for that. Well, we're going to spend some more in Afghanistan. We all understand that. But we're not going to spend as much as the CBO projects, so those savings are not real. Unfortunately, that's in their budget. That's a gimmick. They also say that let's do away with this so-called sequester. This is the thing that the Budget Control Act put in place. And the Budget Control Act said, let's find these savings of $1.2 trillion in spending. And yet, in this budget, they say, no, let's replace that. And so you have to add that as well, because instead of $1.2 trillion, they're saying half of that is going to be new taxes. So that's less spending cuts. So when you add all that up, when you wipe all that away, it looks like the spending increases are about $900 billion over the next decade. So despite all these problems, we're talking about a huge spending increase. Now let's just talk for a second about what the spending increase is on. Oh, and here's the debt chart that shows the debt climbing to $24 trillion over the next 10 years under the Murray budget, under the Democrat budget that we're talking about today. But what is the problem here? Well, we're starting to do more to get the discretionary spending under control. That means the spending that Congress appropriates every year. But when you think about the budget as kind of a pie, 62% of that budget, the biggest piece of that pie, is not spending that Congress appropriates every year. Congress doesn't do it because it's on autopilot. That's interest on the debt that you have to spend. And then it's the very important, vital entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, but that are not sustainable in their current form. And by the way, everybody agrees with that. The president talks about it publicly. Everybody talks about it privately. But the fact is, these programs are incredibly important. We want to ensure that they can continue into the future, and that's why we need to reform them to preserve and protect them. And yet, unbelievably, this budget before us does absolutely nothing there. In fact, when you add up the changes on the entitlement programs over the next 10 years, which again is the biggest reason for these huge spending increases, in fact, as a percent of GDP, it's the only reason. All of the spending increases are because of those entitlement programs and interest on the debt. All of them, as a percent of the GDP. All of them. And yet this budget doesn't touch it. In fact, it slightly increases spending as compared to the CBO baseline, as compared to what we're going to do anyway, that the Congressional Budget Office has just told us about. That to me is the most amazing part of the budget, because it's the responsible thing to do. Again, the president has talked about it. Members of both parties acknowledge this. We have to deal with this issue. If we don't, we're not going to be able to have these programs going forward. Under their budget, the disability fund in Social Security, and a lot of people rely on disability, runs out of money in 2016. Under their budget, the Medicare Trust Fund itself goes bankrupt in 2024. Under their budget, Social Security's fund for senior citizens would go bankrupt in 2033, to the point that under law, and remember, this is just 20 years from now, 25% benefit cut would be put in place. That's what this budget would lead to. So it's hard for me to take it very seriously as a budget. It's, I guess, more of a political document. The final thing that I will say, Madam President, is that if we do this, if we go down this path of more spending next year, more spending the next year, huge increases in spending and taxes over the next 10 years, we will not only have a budget that's out of control, and as I said earlier, risk us having a meltdown in terms of our economy because of a potential crisis we could have, like has happened in Southern Europe. Greece is the country people talk about. But think about what it does to our economy. This huge overhang of debt and deficits, everybody now acknowledges is bad for the economy. Now, some people think it's worse than others, but if you look at these studies, the Rogoff-Reinhardt study has been talked about here on the floor. I know that's the one that says when you get to the level we're at now, you lose about 1 million jobs a year. Well, something's happening in our economy, and I think a lot of it, the negative part of it, is because of this debt and deficit. We're living through the weakest economic recovery in the history of our country, period. All of us are discouraged by it, Democrat, Republican alike. The average growth rate is less than 1% over the last 4 years, and that's not acceptable to any of us. We've got to deal with this issue because it's the right thing to do for our kids and our grandkids, as we've talked about, the right thing to do for these programs so that they're viable and so their trust funds don't go insolvent, but also for today's economy. If we don't deal with this issue, we're not going to have people taking the risk, making the investment. There are companies making money out there. You know what they're doing with it? They're keeping it on the sidelines because they're afraid of this, because they see this coming. They're worried about making the investment. That's how we're going to create the jobs. And right now, in this weakest economy that we've had in a long time, and the weakest economic recovery since the Great Depression, we're looking at unemployment numbers that are unacceptably high. We're looking at a place like Ohio, where we've got a struggle with manufacturing. We're trying to get back on our feet. We're looking for economic growth again. We're not going to get it unless we deal with this issue. The Heritage Foundation has looked at this budget, and they've done an analysis of it in terms of its impact on jobs, on the economy. They have said that the budget will result in losing 800,000 jobs in our country. In my state of Ohio, they said we'll lose 40,000 jobs. We cannot afford to lose 40,000 more jobs. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, we talked about them earlier. This is the group here in Congress that advises us on the economy. They have said that this new debt will reduce long-term economic growth and cost jobs. So ultimately, this is about a choice. Do we want to expand government, or do we want to expand the economy? Do we want to create the opportunity to get the private economy moving, or do we want to grow the size and scope of government? We have a fundamental choice to make here in this chamber with regard to this budget today. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to amend the budget so that we can take out some of the taxes and the spending and the borrowing so that it's better for the economy. Even if we cannot prevail, and if this budget passes over the next couple of days here, I still hope that as a Congress working with the President, we can address this issue. Once this budget debate is behind us on the floor, I hope we can sit down as Republicans and Democrats alike, as Americans, acknowledging that if we don't deal with the spending, we can't get this economy back on track. Acknowledging that trying to tax, spend, and borrow your way to prosperity doesn't work. We've tried it. We've seen the results. We've also seen the opposite. Over time, the great history of this country, the time-honored principles that have made us this cutting-edge economy, that have made us the envy of the world, relied on entrepreneurship, innovation, keeping taxes low, keeping government spending under control, and encouraging the private sector to do what they do best, which is to create jobs. That's why I oppose this budget, Madam President. That's why I also support a better way to bring back the jobs and get our country back on track.